I need to start today's sermon with a caveat. And the reason I need to start today's sermon with a caveat is because I am quoting a friend of mine, a man named Jonathan Montplaisir, who is not from around here. We are here in Redlands. Jonathan is from McAllen, Texas. And if you're thinking, I have never heard of McAllen, Texas, not many people have, is all I'll say. But I met Jonathan through our mutual friend, Hillary, who is the head elder of our church. And since I've met Jonathan, he's been somebody who I really enjoy talking with, specifically about Austin Reeves of the Lakers, as well as political movements and ideas. So I really enjoyed talking with Jonathan. And every now and then we end up in the same city. We end up in the same city when Hillary married Adam. This was us at her wedding. You'll see Jonathan and I holding Hillary up on the chair. We were just thinking, just don't drop her. And then Hillary went rogue and said, I'm going to raise both arms in the air. And you'll notice the chair is dipping slightly toward my side. I was very worried at this point. But a few months after we went to Hillary's wedding, Jonathan invited me out to his wedding, and I had the privilege and honor of officiating his and Sally's wedding. And it was just a great time out in McAllen, Texas. And the caveat that I need to express here is I asked Jonathan, I was talking to him this week, and I asked him if I could quote him in the sermon today. And he said he could, but he said I need to issue a caveat, which is whenever you quote someone from the church, they always sound brilliant and profound and really thoughtful. Jonathan said, I'm none of those things, and I need you to tell everyone that. And my only superpower, if I have one, is I am just morbidly pessimistic. And so I told him I would tell all of you that, and I'm telling you this at the beginning of the sermon so I don't have to interrupt the flow later on, to let you know that Jonathan does not consider himself to be profound, or he wasn't trying to be profound in this moment, but I will tell you that I think he's one of the most profound people I've met. So you can look forward to Jonathan's quote here later on in the sermon. We are telling the story this morning of Haman. Let me hear you say Haman this morning. And Haman is the villain in the book of Esther. Now, we have to recap the story, but we're going to tell this story from Haman's perspective. So we need to go back 2,500 years ago to the town of Susa, the capital city of the Persian Empire, where a man named King Ahasuerus is on the throne. Now, he's on the throne. He's married to a woman named Vashti. We told her story in week 1 of this series. He asks Vashti to perform a lewd sexual act in front of all of his friends. She says no. We celebrate her as a hero today. Back then, she was treated as a villain, and he divorced her and banished her and said, no more Vashti, I want a new queen. And so he sent messengers out across the Persian Empire asking for the most beautiful women in all the empire to come participate in a contest, and he would select the winner from this contest. And so the word got out, and there was one Jewish person living in Persia. His name was Mordecai, and he had an adopted daughter named Esther, and he knew that his daughter would be selected for this contest. And sure enough, she was. Now, as she was going to the contest, Mordecai recommended that she hide her Jewishness, and she did. And she eventually won the contest and became Queen Esther. Immediately upon rising to the throne, Mordecai was near the royal palace when he overheard 2 people talking in the royal courtyard. Their names were Bigthan and Teresh. And as they were talking, Mordecai realized that they were talking about an assassination attempt that they were going to commit soon on the king. And so he warned Queen Esther. Queen Esther then warned the king. They were found to have been true witnesses, and all that it came to be was true. And so the king said, you try to kill me, I'm going to kill you. And these 2 men were hung, and the king was so excited that he said, thank you. And then he wrote this record down in the book of history. Now, after that episode occurs, we are introduced to Haman. And Haman is one of the king's closest advisors. He goes to the king one day, and he says, I have a great idea. I think that if everyone bows to me, they will in extension be bowing to you and showing their reverence and respect for you. So why don't we make a rule that everyone has to bow down to me in extension of you? The king said, that sounds like a great idea. So this rule went out in the streets, and people everywhere bowed down to Haman wherever he went, until one day Mordecai saw him, and Mordecai, as everyone is bowing down to Haman, refuses to bow and stands up in defiance. And Haman sees him, and he becomes so irate and so angry, he says, "This must end, and I must make an example out of Mordecai." So he goes to the king, and he says, "I want you to issue a decree that everyone that shares an ethnic heritage with this man, Mordecai, should be put to death." And the king hears this plan. He says, "That sounds like a great idea. Why don't you go ahead and do that?" And so he sets his royal seal on Haman. Haman takes an edict. He puts it into the king's writing. He sends it out to all corners of the Persian Empire, saying that the Jews will soon be destroyed in a massive genocide because of the disrespect he felt from the man named Mordecai. Mordecai is not intimidated by this situation. He is infuriated, in fact. So much so that he decides to protest. He puts on sackcloth and ashes, the international sign of protest during this day and age, and he goes to the royal palace and begins protesting against the king and this new rule. Now, Queen Esther, who is in the royal palace, hears about this and becomes upset with her adopted father. She becomes upset because he is protesting against her own house. So she sends messengers to Mordecai saying, "Hey, I need you to be more quiet about this. When you're protesting the king, you are an extension protesting me." And when Mordecai hears this, he responds with one of the greatest lines of scripture. We talked about it a couple weeks ago when he says to Queen Esther, "Who knows, Queen Esther, maybe you have come to royal dignity for just such a time as this. And maybe this is the time when you need to stand up and fight for your people, reveal your heritage, and ask the king to stop with this corrupt law that will lead to genocide." After hearing this, Queen Esther decides that she is going to risk her life because she can risk her life when she goes before the king unannounced. And so she decides she's going to go before the king and ask for the king to change his ways, change the law, even though if the king does not like her, he will put her to death. And so after 3 days of fasting, she goes before the king. She says, "Oh, king, I would like to approach the throne and offer a suggestion." The king offers the scepter. She accepts it. And she then says, "I want to invite you and Haman to a dinner tonight. I would love to talk with you and have a dinner with just the three of us." The king says, "Anything you want." And so the king and Haman go, and Esther puts on a royal feast for them, just the three of them, the king, Haman, and Esther. Now, Haman is feeling pretty good about all of this stuff because he loves exclusivity. And the way the Bible tells it, I really enjoy because it's so relatable to me. He says at this point, or the Bible says at this point, that Haman left the palace filled with joy, but when he caught sight of Mordecai in the courtyard, he burned with rage. I don't know about you, but this is relatable to me because I have been happy and feeling great one day, and then all of a sudden I see that one person, I'm like, oh, whole day's ruined, right? It happens to all of us, and this happens to Haman. He's having a great day. He's thinking he's pretty special, and then he sees Mordecai, says, everything's ruined. He then goes back to his wife, Zeresh, and Haman says, "I was having a great day. I saw Mordecai. Can't stand that guy. In fact, I'm trying to commit genocide against his own people. That's how upset I am. What am I going to do?" And Zeresh says, "Why don't you build a gallows? And you can hang him from it. And not just any gallows. Why don't you build it so it's 75 feet tall?" Which is ridiculous, by the way. But that's another story. Build it so it's 75 feet tall tomorrow, and then when it's completed, go ahead and hang Mordecai as an example that everyone needs to respect you, and by extension, the king. Haman feels like that's a great idea, and so he sets to work on building a 75-foot tall gallows, which he completes in a day somehow. Not sure how that works, but that's the timeline the Bible gives us. That night, while he is talking to Zeresh, we then cut to King Ahasuerus, who is having a hard time sleeping. And I don't often identify with the kings in these stories, but there's this moment that I have where I identify with this king because he's having a hard time falling asleep. So he thinks to himself, what can I do that would help put me to sleep? He says, I know, I'll read a history book. And so he asks someone to come in and bring the royal records to him, and he says, just read through the Excel spreadsheet part, and I'll fall asleep here very soon. And eventually he hears about that thwarted assassination attempt with Bigthan and Teresh, and he says, wait a second, I forgot that happened. And he asks the person with the records, he says, did we do anything for Mordecai as a thank you for this gift of like preserving my life? And the person that keeps the record says, no, we haven't done anything. And he said, well, who is here that can help me figure out a way to honor Mordecai because I am indebted to this man? And the person that's the messenger there, he looks around, he says, oh, there's Haman here. And he's, after saying he received nothing, he said, Haman is here, your advisor is here, why don't you ask him? So Ahasuerus invites Haman into his royal bedroom, and he says to Haman these words. What is the correct way to bestow on honor or an individual who should the sovereign wish to do so? And it's here that Haman thinks to himself, who else can Ahasuerus mean but me? And so he starts prepping what would be the highest honor in his head for himself and imagines himself being honored in this way. He tells the king, I want you to take your finest clothes, the best clothes you have, your personal clothes, O great king, and put them on this person that needs to be honored. Then I want you to get your finest stallion, the one that everyone identifies with you, and you would put this person on the royal stallion. And then you would get a messenger, your highest ranking officer, in fact, to go in front of this stallion and declare to everyone in the city as this man is paraded through the city these words. This is the way to treat someone the sovereign wishes to honor. And the king says, that's great. Can you do all of that for Mordecai tomorrow? And Haman's mouth drops, and he realizes that he has suffered a cruel twist of fate. These beautiful mosaics by Lillian Broca are actually zoomed in different parts, and this scene unfolds the very next day where Haman then is leading Mordecai on a horse through the streets of Susa. And everywhere he goes, Haman has to say out loud, this is the way to treat someone the sovereign wishes to honor. This is the way to treat someone the sovereign wishes to honor. This is the way to treat someone the sovereign wishes to honor. This is the way to treat someone the sovereign wishes to honor. And eventually this horse ride ends. The Bible doesn't tell us about how it ends, but I imagine it was awkward. And eventually Mordecai gets off the horse, and Haman goes his separate ways, and we read these words in Scripture. At this, Mordecai returned to the ruler's gate, while Haman went home in shame, hiding in his face in shame as he walked. And it's here that we think to ourselves, isn't this a great story? Isn't it great? The moral is so obvious. The way you treat your enemies is the way you will end up being treated. That is a great moral. We can share it with our family, with our kids, with our friends. If you want to be more hip and edgy and just put it more succinctly, you could say, you want to know what the point of this story is? Karma is a bee. That's what this is about. And so Haman goes home to his wife, Zeresh, and he tells her what happens, and Zeresh says, well, he was Jewish, what did you expect? Which is a really strange response from Zeresh at this point in the story, but that's all she says. At that point then, there is another dinner that Haman is immediately invited to from the queen, Queen Esther, and the king, Ahasuerus. It's the second one in a row, and it's the second night, and they are sitting around, they are drinking wine, they are having a good time, when all of a sudden the king turns to Esther during this second banquet and says, what do you desire, Esther? Anything you say will be given to you. And at this point, Esther decides it's time to reveal her heritage. She says, there is a man who has been persecuting for my heritage, and he is threatening to kill all of my people with a mass genocide, and it's all being done under your watch. Now, I imagine at this point, the dinner becomes very quiet. And King Ahasuerus then has the naivety to say, who is it? As if there's a bunch of genocides that he's ordered recently within his own empire. And Queen Esther responds by saying, our enemy is the scoundrel Haman. At this point, a eunuch that is there at the dinner with them stands up and says, I have seen the 75-foot-tall gallows for myself. It is all going to happen. And upon hearing this, King Ahasuerus becomes irate, and he sentenced Haman to death. And the very gallows that he built to hang Mordecai ends up being the gallows where he is executed. And while there are some more nuances at this point in the story, the theme stays the same, right? we'd probably say something like, this is a great story still. Even though it raises questions about the death penalty, it's a great story because it teaches us that the way you treat your enemies is the way you will end up being treated. And karma comes back around and gets Haman in the worst way. We're talking about the worst kind of villain, right? The one that would commit genocide based on ethnicity. Not that it's better if it's based on anything else. And when you consider that's what this story is, it can be tricky with the death penalty involved, but ultimately it's like, well, he kind of got what he deserved. And if the story ended there, the moral of Esther would be so easy for us to talk about. But it doesn't. In fact, there are 3 chapters left at this point in the story of Esther. And what happens next really muddies the waters. You see, what happens is the king then goes to Mordecai and Esther and says, why don't you guys be in charge of Haman's house? And Esther responds by saying, great, Mordecai will be in charge of Haman's house. And there's another problem, though. We got to still address the genocide because that's a law, and the day is coming when that genocide will go into effect. And so she says, if it is your will, O great king, and if I have pleased you, issue a decree rescinding the letter that Haman wrote and sent, ordering the destruction of the Jewish people throughout the empire. So the king gives her his seal and says, do whatever you want. They write a new decree rescinding the old order. The scribes sit down and they say, let's change the rules. And so the scribes of the Jewish people sit down and they say, okay, we're going to come up with a new decree. In that letter, the decree, Ahasuerus ordered that the Jewish community in each city can be allowed to observe their own laws, defend themselves. Everything's great so far. And then they added one more clause, which was, and act as they wished against their enemies. This rule went out across the empire. And upon hearing it, all of the Gentiles, all of the people who were not Jewish, heard it, and they started converting to Judaism in droves. Why? Not because they were compelled by the mysterious wonder of Yahweh, but because they were afraid. They were terrified because the new edict allowed the Jewish people to do whatever they wanted with someone they deemed to be an enemy. And so as this story unfolds, the nights go by, and the day that the rule is about to go in effect, things start to get a little crazy. We read within Scripture the day on which the enemies of the Jewish community had planned to destroy them, the opposite occurred. It was the Jews who destroyed their enemies. And in the city of Susa alone, the Jews killed 500 people, including the 10 children of Haman. And when you think to yourself, 500 people, that's a lot. Yes, in one day. Can you imagine the bloodshed that all occurred within one own city, right in the same city that the king is living in? Now, it's here that you would assume that the king, who is not Jewish, would step up and say, whoa, what did I sign? What did I say was okay? I gave you the seal. What did you do with it? But the king says something quite different. He says to Esther, your people have killed 500 people in Susa alone. How many more can they be killing in the provinces? Tell me what you desire, and I will grant it. You want to kill more of my people? Go ahead, Esther. I don't care. Whatever you want. And when you look at this contrast between what is going on between the king who's supposed to represent the Persian people and this new queen who can do whatever she wants, she says to the king these words, allow my people to do the same thing tomorrow and hang the bodies of Haman's children in public view. And the king responds by saying, sure, go ahead. So they take the dead corpses of Haman's dead 10 children, hang them in the center of the city to send them a warning and a message, and then they kill 300 more people on the next day. But it doesn't end there, because Susa is just one city in the vast Persian Empire. And this rule went out across the Persian Empire to every corner and every city under its jurisdiction. And we read in Esther chapter 9 that the other Jews who were in the king's provinces also gathered to defend their lives and gain relief from their enemies and killed 75,000 of those who hated them. And it's here that we all of a sudden say, wow, this story's changed a lot. And we start to ask the question, is this a great story? Because it got real brutal real fast. And it was all kind of fun and games while it was happening to Haman. I mean, he kind of got what was coming to him. But 75,000 people. Now, some translations use the word 15,000 there. I think the more reliable translations are 75,000 for a number of reasons. But it doesn't really matter after one. And when you look at Haman, and you look at Esther, and you read the story all the way to the end, not just the convenient parts, there's a question that starts to form that is deeply troubling. Are Haman and Esther really all that different? What's the difference between Esther and Haman? Yes, Haman was the original aggressor in this story, right? Haman was the one who struck first. But come on, you can't imagine that Esther batted 1,000 with the 75,000 people that she ended up killing, that every one of those people deserved to die. And Esther, when she gets the power, she says, we now have the power to do what was going to happen to us. Let's go ahead and do it to others. And I don't know if you know this, but didn't solve all the Jewish people's problems when they killed everyone. Esther is not the last book of the Hebrew Bible. There are more problems that unfold after the book of Esther. And when you consider what she did and how this story unfolds, it raises all kinds of questions of, wasn't there a better way to handle all of this? I mean, after all, within Esther's own scriptures, there are all sorts of verses that prohibit this kind of thing and, in fact, encourage the opposite behavior. In the book of Exodus, God speaks to Moses and says, when you come upon your enemy's ox or donkey going astray, you shall bring the donkey or ox back. When you see the donkey of one who hates you lying under its burden, you must help to set the donkey free. This is an order from God in the Jewish tradition. Not only that, but there's a proverb that says, if your enemies are hungry, give them bread to eat. And if they are thirsty, give them water to drink. And then the proverb goes on to say why. In doing this, you will heap coals of fire on their heads, and the Lord will reward you. In other words, kill them with kindness. That's how you handle your enemies. In the book of Leviticus, God says to Moses, you shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against any of your own people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. And yet, when Esther steps into power, she acts almost identically to how Haman acted once he stepped into power. And while it could be justified that the first steps were done in self-defense, it got out of hand really quickly, didn't it? And at the heart of this story seems to be a message all of a sudden, which is, yeah, treat your enemies the way you want to be treated, but also this world is kill or be killed. So make sure that you kill your enemies, because that's the only way to really survive here. Now, what's really surprising about all this is if we fast forward thousands of years, we come across the unhealthy version of church, which for millenniums now has stood up in front of people and said, hey, we worship a good God, a God of love, and the way he's going to solve the world's problems is he's just going to slaughter all of God's enemies. And when we get to the end of time, we got this book, Revelation. It is the last book in the Bible, they would say. And once God kills all the evil people, then we can experience peace, joy, love, happiness, and hope. And when you consider God from that perspective, the picture that the unhealthy church has given us, you look at what God is doing in that picture of salvation, and you compare it with Haman and Esther, and you say, this is all kind of the same story, isn't it? Shouldn't we expect more from God than the behavior of Haman? Shouldn't we think that God come up with something better than, well, if you can't get along with them, just kill them, because there's no other way to experience happiness? It's kill or be killed. And if somebody can't say, I believe in Jesus, the Son of God, well, they cannot be tolerated any further. Can't God give us something better than what Haman threatened to do and what Esther actually did in the story? when I hear these words and think of this story and read Esther to the end, I'm reminded of the words of Jesus of Nazareth, who Christians believe to be the Son of God. Jesus was fully Jewish, and he said things that leaned into the progressive leanings of his scripture and his tradition. And there were those words from Leviticus he took, and he said, actually, God can give you something better than the idea that it's kill or be killed. Jesus, in the Sermon on the Mount, said these words, "You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be children of your Creator in heaven. God makes the sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the righteous and on the unrighteous." This is a beautiful illustration that Jesus pulls here, because Jesus views the sun and rain as blessings. And he sees people receiving both light, health, energy from the sun, and also the renewal that comes with the rain. And he says, well, if God allows all of them to experience it, why are we being so discriminatory with our understanding of God? He then goes on to say, for if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? You think you're great because you love the people who are nice to you? Who cares? Don't even the tax collectors, the people who sell out our country for their own personal benefit, can't they do that? You think you're a special person because you like the people who are like you and treat you nicely? There's nothing special in that. The real measure of being a child of God is loving your enemies. And the older I get as a person, the more I'm convinced that if I could only take one passage of Scripture from the Bible and keep it with me for the rest of my life, this would be it. I don't think there's anything more valuable in the entire Christian tradition. I, of course, love the entirety of the Bible, but if someone said you could only take one passage with you, I think it's this one. To explain why that is, I want to do a little thought experiment. Let's assume that heaven is real, and heaven actually occurs. And there's this end of time, we're all there, and you're sitting up there in heaven, and you're thinking now about the people who are there. Who's there? Who is there in your mind? Is it more people than you expected? Is it less people than you expected? Is the person that you can't stand there? Is that person your neighbor for all eternity? What would happen? Would you go to God and complain to God and say, I think there's been a mistake? That person that I can't stand is living next to me, and I don't know how to change my address in this whole heavenly scheme. So what am I supposed to do? And it's here that I imagine God smiling at you and saying, oh, I'm going to teach you how to love them, and we've got an eternity to figure it out. Well, that's the work of God, right? Imagine if you could love the least lovable person on the planet. That would be a testimony. That would be some power, wouldn't it? That doesn't require any belief that Jesus walked on water. It just requires you to believe that there's something worthwhile in trying to learn how to love your enemy. And I've spent a lot of time with atheists and agnostics. Some of my best friends are atheists and agnostics. I will tell you, a few years ago, when people would ask me my testimony, I would say to them, well, you know, I'm a sinner, and Jesus Christ died for my sins so I can go to heaven. It just fell flat every time. They would ridicule it, they'd pick it apart, they would say things like, is this a good God? But when I would change the testimony to what I truly believe now is real, and now I can say to them, well, I believe in this because I found that my faith in God has led me to love the people that I originally believed to be unlovable. I found nothing but respect from atheists and agnostics for this. Now, they may think I'm crazy for believing it because sometimes I think it's crazy too. But that's where faith comes in. Because if you truly trust that the best way forward is to learn how to love those who are unlovable, it will require you to do some things that are illogical. That's what it means to be a person of faith. Yes, this person treated me horribly, but I'm going to continue to try to figure out how to love them because I believe that's where Jesus is leading me. And if you picture heaven And in heaven, it's only the people who get along with you, and you realize that you're not upset that anybody's there, well, at that point, my friend, I would point out that you are playing God, not following God. You will be surprised by who is in heaven because the grace of God is greater than any grace you could contain. And you will have to learn to love some people in heaven that are difficult to love now. So you might as well start now, right? There's no reason to wait for the next life when we already know where God is leading us now. This brings us to the year 2025. And I have the honor and privilege of being your pastor, and I get to talk to you all on a regular basis, and I will tell you, our congregation has a lot of anxiety right now. A lot of anxiety. And a lot of it is traced back to this political situation that we are in. And if you've been here before, you've heard me say this before, but I want to say it again for anyone who's here the first time. I want you to know I'm going to tell you how I voted and what kind of politics I support. At this church, you don't have to vote the same as me to be part of this church. We don't have to believe the same things as me politically to be part of this church. And I also want to speak to you and share some things that I think this story is telling all of us that I think would be helpful. So first, I want to speak to people who voted for Donald Trump because I did not, and continue to support Donald Trump. If you're finding that you don't have a lot of anxiety because of the political situation, you may be looking at this story and thinking, okay, what's this about? How can this be helpful to me? I would encourage you to talk to somebody who does have a lot of anxiety and say, I'm having some hard time understanding where this anxiety is coming from. Can we sit down over coffee and just talk about it? And in that moment, if you are somebody who has those political leanings and feels like there's not a lot to be anxious about right now, in that moment when you take them out to coffee, I have a few questions for you as you imagine this happening. Can you listen to that person who has anxiety? Can you empathize with them? Can you learn from them, because everyone is our teacher? And can you love them? Because even if you view them as your political enemy, we are all called as Christians to follow Jesus and learn how to love people who think differently than us, and that includes how we vote and what party we're affiliated with. Now, at this point, if you are part of the same party that I am, which is, if you haven't figured it out, a Democrat at this point, I want to encourage you to think about if this actually happens. If someone were to ask you that identifies differently than you and supports different politicians, ask you out to coffee, and you have a sense that they're being sincere. It's not to have a debate and try to figure it out, but they actually want to learn and try to understand things they're having a hard time understanding. The question I would have for you is, if you got invited to this coffee, do you think you could share your perspective, and even though you have different political views, you could share your perspective without blaming the person you're talking to? Because blaming tends to divide us. And it's hard to change people. It's hard to teach people. It's also hard to learn from people if you start blaming. But if you can say, this is what I believe and why I'm convicted by it, that's a different conversation. And if you ever get asked to go out to coffee because somebody's having a hard time understanding, can you do it in a way where it doesn't devolve or just lower down to the level of blaming? Because I think that that's the way that we get past this hyper-partisanship. It's not by us mitigating our beliefs. It's by us being willing to move past that and say, this is what I believe and where I'm trying to go with this. And rather than trying to blame all the time, we just work on something together going forward. So, if you voted for Trump, you support Trump, I want you to know there are people in this room that have anxiety. And if you're not having anxiety, I would encourage you to hear why the people here have anxiety and see if there's anything you can learn and love in that moment. So for the people who did not vote for Donald Trump and do not support this president, I have to tell you, the last couple of months have been hard for me as a pastor, as it's been hard for you, because I feel this pressure to stand up in front of all of you and give hope, even when I don't feel like I have hope. And I've tried my best to be a pastor in this position as a genuine, real, authentic human being. I always try to say things that I believe and feel on the inside. And there are some weeks that's easy. There are other weeks it's hard. And there's weeks since January it's been easy, but to do it week after week after week has been difficult. And I was expressing this to my friend Jonathan because we were talking about politics, and I was expressing I just feel so much pressure to give hope when I don't feel it. And Jonathan, very profoundly might I add, said to me these words: have you considered that maybe hope is not what they need? And I said, what do you mean? And he said, maybe it's not a time for hope right now. And he said, you could do something like this. Is there a story in the Bible where the people of God are living in exile? I said, well, there's one in Esther, which we're studying right now, where they're living in the Persian Empire, away from Jerusalem, away from home. And he said, well, were they in a hopeless situation? I was like, well, yeah, Esther was there. She at one point thought her people were going to be killed by genocide. And then he said, what happened? Were they away? And I said, well, they were away from home and comfort. They didn't know which way was up and which way was down. He said, kind of like now for some of us. I said, kind of like now. And then he kept asking, so what happened next? And I told him, and then I got to this part of the genocide with Haman and Esther. And he said, yeah, it doesn't sound like a lot of hope to me. And when I look at this story and what's unfolding, I feel like we're in this part of the story before Esther rises to power. And as we're talking here and looking at what this country is between Redlands and McAllen, the question we should be asking is, have we considered that maybe hope isn't the right reaction for every day, right? And when I consider this story and how it evolves into Esther doing what Haman wished that he could do, just to a different people group, when I look at this story, I think about how when people were disempowered, I wonder if they were saying to each other, just wait till we're in charge. We're going to show those guys. We're going to seek vengeance. We're going to do what they did to us, and we're going to make them rue the day they messed with us. But is that what we actually want going forward? Do we want to just do the same thing over and over again that produces these results? Or do we want to try something different? Because maybe this method of just saying, well, it's okay as long as we're in charge, maybe that doesn't really get us to where we're trying to go. Maybe instead of trying to figure out how to hope in a hopeless situation, maybe we're being invited to see the United States of America with clarity that we haven't been invited to see it with before. And when you look back through history, you realize that it's not just this moment, but other people have tried to call our attention to this moment and the clarity of this country in really radical terms. If you go back to April 4, 1968, you know that this is a date that is tragic in the history of the United States because this is the day that Martin Luther King was murdered. Now, what I just found out this week, because I read a biography on him and I just finished it, is the day of his murder, he'd actually phoned his church that he was pastoring in Atlanta, and he had given them the sermon title for Sunday's sermon. Now, April 4 was a Thursday, and he was killed in the early evening, late afternoon, and he called them, the church, in the early afternoon, and his sermon title, just hours before he was assassinated, was this: Why America May Go to Hell. And this is before he knew he was going to be shot by an American. And if you read the last 3 years of his life, his tone changes significantly. He's still concerned with the evils of society, and he still is working against them, but he becomes stronger and more clear in what he needs to stand for, even when it's unpopular. He took a stand against the Vietnam War in 1967, 1 year to the day before his death. On April 4, he went to New York and he preached a sermon called Beyond Vietnam. And overnight, he became the face of the anti-war movement. But in that sermon, in which he condemned the Vietnam War because he was a Nobel Peace Prize winner and he felt an obligation to speak out against war, he said these words in this sermon. He said, I am convinced that if we are to get on the right side of the world revolution, we as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of values. We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. When machines and computers, profit, motives, and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, extreme materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. If we do not shift to making people the priority, we will continue to suffer from extreme materialism, racism, and militarism. These are his three evils of society. In the last year of his life, he brought these three up over and over again whenever he could. He said, these are the problems our nation is suffering from. We have to do something about it. And he saw it clearly at a time when very few people did in 1968. And he came to the conclusion, maybe hope isn't the answer here. Maybe we need to give a clear view as to what America actually is. And rather than just going down the same road and trying the same thing and electing the same kind of president and the same kind of local officials, maybe we need a radical revolution that moves us from being so concerned with owning things and being better than other people and being the most powerful to all of a sudden being someone who's concerned with the poor, being concerned with what's best for everyone, being concerned with what is good for the planet long term. And when you consider our situation in 2025, I imagine Martin Luther King rolling in his grave as at the presidential inauguration when he said these words about computers and profit margins and extreme materialism, there at the inauguration and all the tech giants, none of the human activists. And to think that he thought in 1968, we were suffering from extreme materialism when he had never heard of Amazon Prime is frightening. So when we look at the country today, what is it that you actually see? What is it that you actually want? Do you think that if we keep going down the same road, we'll all of a sudden get different results? I know for the people who've had anxiety in this room, one thing that we've said over and over again is, I just can't believe this is where we're at. Well, it's time to accept that this is where we're at. Because once we accept that this is where we're at, we can acknowledge that maybe we need to do something in a vastly different direction in order to tackle the real evils of society. To be more concerned with people than things. We are at a moment in history that reminds me of a biblical story long ago. And we can either dream about getting our revenge and just being the kind of team that only cares about our own people, or we can shift from a thing-oriented society to a people-oriented society. My friends, whether it's a political level or a personal level, my wish for you this morning is this. May your faith in God teach you how to love those who are unlovable. May you listen to another's anxiety and embrace them as your teacher. May you see who we are with clarity, and may this clarity inspire a brand new way of living. Oh, we got a little bit ahead there. Do we have one more slide there, Arthur, or was that it? I'm just going to go. I just have to wing it at this point. I just have to believe it. This is it. If you've ever criticized the politician for using teleprompter, I'm just as guilty. And it's back. Everything's fine. This moment. Let's try this again. And may we never allow our political identities to supersede our identity as children of God. And if we are children of God, we are concerned with the poor. We are concerned with the well-being of the planet. And we are concerned with the equality of all. Amen.